I moved to New York in 1966 after having spent a couple of years. I had been a school teacher in Detroit, and then I had gone and spent a year and a half teaching in Italy, and then I returned to the United States, spent a small time in Detroit. My parents had all died at that point, and I said, well, I got to go to New York. That's where everything is happening. I went into the Lower East Side and became part of the scene of New York, filmmaking, political, and what have you. I guess I should say one thing more. While still in Detroit in the 1950s, there was an intellectual circle grew up, following Papu's thinking. The year I entered Wayne State University, they eliminated all the socialist clubs. And I said, they don't want me to know about this, so I got to know about this. So I started looking for all the socialist meetings, just out of curiosity. And what I heard there made more sense than I would have heard in economics class. And most of the people there that had public meetings still were vaguely of the Trotskyist movement. They were kind of post-Trotskyist, but they were anti-Stalinist. And they had a particular approach to society. And that's where I met a lot of black people, very much like myself. And I often thought about them because their parents were Horiati from the South. And they come to Detroit in order to work in the factories, and they had told their kids, we don't want you to work in the factories, we want you to go to school. And the people I met were people who had gone to school and had an education. Those guys would eventually form very important political organizations in Detroit, and I knew them quite well. So later on, when I went back to Detroit to write a book about them, they knew who I was and they trusted me, where I wasn't a stranger. And I have to say too, this, they liked the fact that you were an ethnic, and they didn't want you to act, quote, act black. Just act Greek, that's good enough. In other words, just be yourself. And then suddenly you find more things in common by being who you are and who they are than you pretending, not pretending, but trying to understand, quote, you know what I'm saying? So many people who were attracted to the black movement try to act black or be black. And that wasn't really very well respected in Detroit. That was looked down upon. Who you were was good. Did you know who you were? They were interested to know if you knew who you were. If you knew who you were, then in fact we can talk. If you don't know who you are, then we can't be serious. So then I went back to New York. There were two major activities. One, we started a film magazine called Cineast. I didn't start it, but I was there early on, which was about the art and politics of the cinema. And we created that because we felt that American reviewers and the American system was not addressing real issues and leaving out politics. As Bertolt Brecht said, to write about the trees sometimes means to be silent about other things. And we thought American cinema is silent about a lot of things. And so we wanted to bring out attention to films that were not silent. And at the same time, we didn't think it was just because your politics were correct meant your film was any good. Because there are a lot of political films that are just awful. And they make you sick, and intellectually sick. So we said, if you really want to influence people, you gotta have some good work. Your art, you have to be artistic. So we brought the art and politics together. And similarly, that drew me to a group called Black Mask, which was a group that was very avant-garde in its terms of its aesthetics. The guy who started was a visual artist, and he believed in black and white, and what you can do with black and white. Part of working with black and white, of course, was to realize that there was gray, but not to deal with gray, but artistic. It was kind of an interesting idea. And we did a lot of provocations of art people. Sometimes it would be, usually it was artists who were very abstract and apolitical, and we would just have provocations where we yell from the audience and get into debates with them and disrupt things. We're not very, in that sense, we were very disruptive. And the underlying philosophy of the group was anarchism. And I hesitate to say that because when you say anarchism, immediately people think, well, throws a bomb and doesn't have a brain in their head. Our anarchism was not this half-baked, thing. We knew the anarchist texts and so forth, and the person that we were most influenced by was Kropotkin, and we used to be a joke on TV. Oh, Professor Kropotkin, they would make fun of his name and so forth. But basically, what his idea was that, first of all, we were for organization. We weren't against organization. So we weren't anti-organization, because anarchists usually thought, well, they don't believe in anything. No, we believe in something. We even have an organization. What kind of organization? It is an organization which is built on mutual aid, that people help each other, and by helping each other, they all prosper better. I mean, the Kennedy said, "All in rising tide, all boats rise," but that's not true under capitalism. But it could be true. So mutual aid is, in fact, by helping each other and having mutual aid, the tide does lift up everybody. And it was very important that we be anti-authoritarian, that organizations could not be ruled by the great mind, could not be ruled by the central committee, could not be ruled by some priestly caste which told everybody else what to do. The base would tell the leadership what it wanted, and in fact the leadership would revolve. There would be no one leader for a long time, because in that sense, there's a wonderful essay that I read in Detroit about Athens, with the idea of how do you select a jury? It was the first 12 people to come in. That's your jury. That's it. Who's mayor? This one's mayor. Next year we'll have somebody else. If your society is equalitarian, then you can do that. So that was our view, what we were trying to accomplish. Yeah, is that idealistic and so forth? Yeah, but it's a vision, and unless you have a vision, you can't ever get there if you haven't thought about it. And we thought that, what can 3, 15, or 20 people do? We can't attack the Pentagon with 20 people. I mean, and plus, if you attack, so what? What you can do is you can create artistic events that will somehow capture these ideas and perhaps will serve as a catalyst for a wider movement. And so we try to work within the anti-war movement and to some degree with the Black liberation movement. We didn't last long enough and so forth to be effective, but we tried. And we had some influence. We had some effect. Now, that group eventually evolved, but I sort of got pulled out. I was very active in the anti-war movement and slightly active in New York, not so much in the Black liberation movement. In Detroit, I'd been involved in the Black liberation movement. But then 1967, so they called me up in the middle of the night one night and said, hey, the tanks are rolling into Athens. There's going to be a demonstration today at the outside the consulate, so I'm going to be there. My thought was, some of those things we've been doing in the anti-war movement, things we learned in the Black liberation movement, things we learned in the Black Mask, could now be transferred to be used in the Greek community. And one of the things the people in the Black liberation movement always said was, organize your own people. Well, you don't have to organize black people. We'll organize black people. You organize white people. But they didn't mean something stupid like, oh, go into a factory, get a job in a factory, and somehow you're going to change unions. That's not going to happen. But this seemed to be an opportunity to me personally, that here was democracy destroyed in Greece. Here was a person who was an activist as me, and here's the Greek American community. the Greek American community, as I knew it, was proud of Athens, the cradle of democracy. Oh, they couldn't stop talking about that. There's a parade or something. That's what they talked about. I said, well, they're going to be angry. They're going to really be. They're not going to allow this, and we can actually put an end to this dictatorship. And all they really need is some tough spokesmen, some clear speaking people to announce it. And yes, they're going to respond. Well, they didn't. I mean, basically, we had a very hard time finding the right audience. I was very disappointed in the Greek Americans. And then I began saying to myself, well, what was it in Greek America that brought this attitude of passivity? And what was the conditions in Greece which allowed the junta in the first place? And I'd been in Greece in 1965, and I'd seen the street demonstrations, and I saw how many people in the street. Anna Tesserau, we were against the king and so forth. And I had come back to Detroit at that time. Actually, I gave a speech. My first political speech I ever gave was I said, well, there's going to be social upheaval in Greece, which would either be positive or dictatorship. I didn't think it would be the dictatorship, but it turned out that's what it was. And I was surprised by various things. Later on, one of the leading figures in New York was Melina McCurry. She gave us her prestige and so forth. She was quite good, I think, in this way. And I got to be pretty close with her brother Spiros. And one day said, we got to do something with the Archbishop. The Archbishop's got to take a position on this. And here's the irony. Here's Iakovos had just, what I forget if it was before or right after he'd marched with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, which was wonderful. I mean, he was, done the right thing. And so we went in front of the where he was living on 76th Street, and called him to come and speak to us, and he wouldn't come out. And I remember Spiro, he had on he's a rich guy, he had a very expensive suit. He ripped his suit, so Greek. And we struggled. And now there was also trouble within the movement, because within the movement was very cowardly. Here I'm coming from Black Mass, I'm from Black Liberation, we're coming back from anti-war, New Left, do things. The other thing I should say about Black Mass, we believe in direct action. Not every action, but take actions. The courts, you're going to lose in the courts, you're going to lose with money. Don't fight on the territory you're going to lose. Fight on the territory you think you're going to win. Got into the Greek American community, and I didn't know that much about Greek history at that time. I knew something, but not a lot. And I was just appalled. They were so cowardly. First of all, there was a whole group of people who didn't want to talk about the left-wing prisoners, Ritsos, all the people, but Manolis Glazos, and so forth. And I said, what are you going to do? You're going to have free some of the political prisoners? I said, what's the matter with you? Are you people crazy? And they kind of thought I was a wild guy, and I wasn't really. Sometimes you can get wild, and when you've been wild, I was being very reasonable. I said, you cannot have free some of the political prisoners. And they say, well, they're going to call us communists. I said, let them call you. So what? You know what you are. Just get out there and say it. And we had to struggle really hard. And I formed a subcommittee, the Ritsos Z Theodorakis Committee, which is like Black Mass, see? Saying, okay, you don't want to do that, you don't want to issue, we're going to issue these statements. And we put out some booklets and so forth under that name, and eventually that became an organization called Demokratia. Well, they came around. Eventually they came around, and Molina was very good at doing that. But that should not have been a struggle. That should not. Now, the funny part of it was there were some old leftover communists from the Spartacus Club from the 1920s. And they were among the most timid because they had not been politically active for a long time. And now they are back in the action. And they didn't want to do anything to disrupt the situation. And so I was very frustrated. One direct action we took, I'll give you an example of a direct action. The King of Greece was coming to visit the UN for 3 days. And I said, we've got to do something. you know, and they sent a petition letter to the New York Times, stuff like that. I said, let's do something. And we couldn't think of anything. I said, okay, I'm not going to eat as long as the king is here. And so I and two other guys, Dimitrios Kokoros and Kostas Steriou, went. We owed a blanket outside of the UN. We sat down. We said, we're not going to eat until this guy leaves this country, because it's unthinkable for us to eat while this guy is here who supports the junta. I saw it clearly as an artistic event, but a political artistic event. And people say, who's going to care? Three guys not eating. Who cares? Well, WORT cared. And they came with the radio, and it was time to talk. They put the microphone. I end up being the spokesman. And many times this has happened during the anti-junta movement. I end up being the spokesman because one of us American-born, so they couldn't, there was no papers to be worked. And I didn't have any close relatives in Greece, so I could not, there was no retribution. And also I could speak clearly, whatever. So I ended up being the spokesperson, even when I wasn't all that important. So I became a spokesperson all over the radio. They thought, hey, these guys are sitting down there, and people began talking about the junta in New York, saying, those guys, are they really? Are they really? No, they're reading. No, they're not reading. Go down and see. And people come and looked and see. And there were guys from the junta came. You could see from their shoes they were from the junta, And then two other people joined us. And so there were 5 of us. And it was a small event, but it did what it was supposed to do. And it took 3 days. And it was healthy, I've thought about this a lot, and I've had a reconception of the history of the Greeks in America. I believe from 1492 to 1880, somehow there was Greek identity. But there was no Greek state for most of that time. When there was a Greek state from 1820 on, it was small. It was, just Peloponnesus and a few islands. And yet there was a clear thing that there was such a thing as Greek, and the Americans were very pro-Greek. Named cities after Greece. The aristocrats of the American Revolution, like Jefferson, were raised in Greek and Latin, so they could write in Greek and read in Greek. And Jefferson exchanged correspondence with Correas. And when the Greek Revolution broke out, the Americans were 100% for it. Hundreds of newspapers, money, even volunteers went to fight for Greece. So there was something called Hellenism that was good. Then from 1880 to about 1940, something completely changed, because at this point the mass migration had started in America. And the native-born Americans said, who are all these foreigners coming? And are these, particularly the Greeks particularly, are they really European? They're sort of semi-European, and then some of them did come from Turkey, and some of them were coming from islands or are run by the Italians and what have you. And the Greeks had a very low profile. And it would take a long time, and people have talked about the first 20 years in particular were very difficult, and HEPA got started and what have you. But the Greeks themselves didn't know what they wanted to do. And so I call those the American Greeks. They were Greeks trying to adjust to America. Did they want to adjust to America? Now, many of them thought they could be like Egyptians. They thought it'd be like Egyptian Greeks, where they could continue the Greek language, have Greek schools, and just be in business. That is never going to work in the United States. And Charlie Muscles and I agreed on this particular thing. We call these people American ethnics, because what you discover from 1920 onward is the American culture determines the nature of the Greek society, not Greek culture. And 25 or 50% of the Greeks returned to Greece. So that's quite an interesting statistic, one of the highest return rates of any ethnic group. Then a lot of Greeks die young of the immigrants because they're in terrible jobs. whether they're in mining or whether they're in textiles and so forth, the average lifespan is like 25 to 30. And then a lot of Greeks are bachelors. So the idea of a Greek family in the church and so forth develops relatively slowly. And it really isn't until the late 20s and the 30s that group begins to emerge. And there are the battles with the Ku Klux Klan and all this kind of stuff. When Roosevelt comes in, Roosevelt begins to be for the foreign-born. I mean, it's part of his political process. And Roosevelt, when he realized World War II was coming, asked Hollywood to make films which were pro-foreign-born. And they also had radio programs, because radio was big in that. And so there are programs on the radio and TV and films now, which began to show the foreigners, the foreign-born Americans as true Americans. And there was a lot of Detroit, I mean, you have to realize, we think of the South, Detroit had the Black Legion. The Black Legion were Ku Klux Klanners, plus they wore black robes, they had guns, they had skull and crossbones on, anti-black, anti-Semitic, anti-foreign-born, anti-union. And the New Deal closed them down. We also, in Detroit, had Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest, and he had a radio program. He had 6 million people listening to his radio program, anti-foreign-born, anti-union, anti-Semitic, not anti-Catholic. And he was not closed down until the Pope closed him down just at the outbreak of World War II. So Detroit, we were very much aware of those things. Other cities had similar organizations. So the Greeks before 1940 were aware they were being accepted, they were moving toward, being assimilated, but at the same time there's a real enemy out there. 1940 changed things quite a bit. When the Greeks defeated Mussolini's army, the image of Greek Americans changed almost overnight. Now it was good to be Greek. Greeks had defeated a fascist army. The French hadn't done it. The British, nobody else. The Greeks had done it. Sure, they'd been taken over by the Germans, but the famous thing by Churchill said, heroes don't fight. Greeks don't fight like heroes. Heroes fight like Greeks. That's powerful stuff. So that's when being Greek in America was okay. And from the 1950s onwards, I think we now have Greek Americans, people who are American of Greek heritage. But what's clear to me, and I think it's clear to all the other historians, and they hint at it but don't quite underline it, it's a path of extinction. If you continue to be a Greek American, it means that if you don't revive the Greek language and you continue to have out marriage and American values continue to be the dominant values in the community, it's going to get weaker and weaker and weaker until you become extinct. So the only way for the Greek American community to survive, I think, the 21st century would be to go back to the earlier 1492, 1880, and I call that Neo-Hellenism, in which Greek and American are both kept. We become bilingual again, become bicultural again, and that's a way forward. It's possible. Is it probable? I don't know. This is the book I wrote about growing up in Detroit. It deals with the first 24 years of my life. It goes into detail about many things I just kind of whisked over here. And borrowing a little bit from Elia Kazan, I can say that I'm a Greek by blood, an American by birth, and I'm a Hellenic because I've chosen to make that journey.
This is fantastic. This is fantastic. Wow.
You like it, huh?